So my name is Loretta Low. I am today's chair. I'm the chair of today's webinar, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our today's speakers, Dr. Janelle LAMOREAUX, who's an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Arizona, and her research explores the intersections of reproductive and also environmental health with a special focus on epigenetic scientific practice. And her book, Infertile Environments, was recently published by Duke University Press. So I think we'll hear more about it in a second. So if you're ready, Janelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much to you, Loretta, and for the invitation to speak today to everyone in the Sci-Tech Asia team and for making this possible behind the scenes. I really appreciate the invitation. As mentioned, my book was just recently published, came out in January officially. And today I'm going to be focusing on an overview of the book and some excerpts from the book itself. This is a largely ethnographic text, so it's based on time that I spent in China, but that time was over a decade ago now. So I know a lot has changed, both politically and scientifically, since I did the ethnographic portion of this research. But I think and hope that the book still speaks to a lot of urgent questions surrounding reproduction, reproductive politics, environmental health, and questions about what counts as the environment, both in and outside of the sciences. So with that, I'll dive in. So one of the main arguments of infertile environments is highlighted by the structure of the book itself. And the book is organized around 5 environments that were prominent in the research of toxicologists, as well as the activities of environmental activists and media entities that I studied in China that interacted with these toxicological experts. Each chapter is meant to encourage readers to think about what it means to conceptualize and to materialize the environment in these various ways, especially through epigenetic research practices, which I'm going to describe in a minute. Through the organization of the book and the content of its chapters, I ask, what does the environment mean to those who study its connection to reproductive health, especially men's infertility? And what kind of responsibility for men's reproductive health is imagined when the environment is conceptualized and materialized at these various scales? While the chapters are separate and sequential, they also overlap. Likewise, environments are not only multiple, enacted by people and through technologies in various ways, they also come into being in relation with other environmental forms. So in the book, I understand materializations of environments as a means through which toxicologists and others both oversimplify single potential causality and attempt to understand complex associative relationships between these environmental scales. The national hormonal, dietary, maternal, and laboratory environments are then made to stand apart, even though they're partially connected. My interest in thinking through the causality of men's reproductive health issues, particularly male infertility, partially began through my personal experience working at an infertility treatment clinic in New York before and during my graduate studies. So in the book preface, I discuss my time as a patient coordinator at the Cornell University Affiliated Center for Reproductive Medicine and Infertility, or CRMI, which is pictured here. While working at CRMI, I helped patients from around the world navigate the often difficult process of infertility treatment through reproductive technologies. Many of the patients I coordinated had been unsuccessfully treated for infertility prior to their appointment at CRMI. During my 2 years in this position, I spoke with hundreds of individuals and couples undergoing treatment for infertility, many of whom had grappled with this diagnosis for some time. Because this was a nationally renowned treatment center, many patients had tried IVF elsewhere and were seeking CRMI expertise as a last resort. Most patients were diagnosed with either female factor or male factor infertility. Still, approximately 20% of patients were diagnosed with unexplained infertility. While male and female factor infertility diagnosis seem to point to some specific cause for an inability to become pregnant, unexplained infertility was less clear. Low sperm counts, irregular periods, polyps or fibroids, low sperm quality, anti-sperm antibodies. These were conditions often discovered during diagnostic procedures. However, these conditions weren't really causal factors, more like inhibiting symptoms of a bigger problem or broader issue poorly understood. My desire for a more generous rendering of especially unexplained infertility and its cause increased as I was repeatedly asked by the patients that I helped and later friends, why? Why can't I get pregnant? Why is it so easy for others my age to conceive? Such questions take on heightened meaning at a moment when individuals are increasingly blamed for health problems. Questions about why a specific person is infertile can quickly turn into answers that stress individual and gendered responsibility for reproductive health. For instance, patients often wondered if they had done something to cause their infertility or were doing something wrong in their efforts to conceive. They looked for suggestions for things they could do or take or eat or abstain from to make themselves fertile. Not only do such pursuits show how determined many people are to meet personal, social, cultural, and familial expectations of biological relatedness, as Sarah Franklin's work describes, they also show how people internalize the idea that pregnancy is an accomplishment. This is especially the case for women, since infertility has historically been conceptualized as a woman's problem, and women's bodies continue to take center stage during infertility treatments, as for instance, Karis Thompson's work shows. While working at CRMI, I wondered if other fertility experts were thinking about the influence of conditions of life outside the body that might lead to infertility. In order to locate such a perspective, I had to step outside the clinic, both physically and conceptually. I shifted my study's focus from the treatment of infertility to research on infertility. I also shifted from focusing on women to focusing on men, as men's infertility research had a more outward-facing orientation, while research on women's infertility seemed to still be tethered to the body. Finally, and arguably most importantly, I shifted the geographic site of my research from the US to China for a variety of reasons, including an interest in the frameworks through which sperm decline was being discussed in the PRC. So many of you are probably familiar with discourse surrounding sperm decline. Every 5 years or so, Euro-American media prophesizes humanity's extinction due to a near sperm apocalypse, as you can see here. Such news cycles are loosely based on studies of sperm, which in my early analysis of such discourse, I noticed seemed to characterize male infertility almost as a proxy diagnosis for a world order struggling to reproduce itself. Reading through studies of sperm coming from China in particular, I was struck by how often issues that I was reading about in the anthropology of China, such as rapid social economic change, industrialization, development, were foregrounded in sperm research. I found the similarities between anthropological concepts such as local biologies and social determinants of health and understanding of sperm decline being presented, especially by toxicologists in China, quite resonatingly fascinating, and began submitting grant applications that proposed thinking with sperm scientists in China as a method for studying the apparent biosocial phenomenon of Chinese sperm decline. My research was designed in 2008 and took place in subsequent years, primarily in 2011, mostly in Nanjing, at a time when the idea of a global sperm crisis was frequently in the news. But the introduction of the book opens a couple of years later with a news event from 2013, when the Meteorological Association of the PRC released a paper on climate change that highlighted both the economic and health effects of pollution. In a description of how urbanization in China had increased the country's carbon footprint, the report briefly mentioned the potential negative influence of pollution on human reproductive health. Media coverage and commentary quickly focused in on this provocative connection. Journalists began interviewing fertility experts who described a quote-unquote sperm bank emergency in China, even more exaggerated than the sperm shortages that had come before. Since 2002, multiple regional sperm bank emergencies have been declared as local sperm banks reported that the quality of donor sperm was in decline, as discussed by the work of I.O. Wahlberg. Initial speculation about the cause of this decline focused on lifestyle factors, diet, and stress levels. 10 years after these first regional shortages had been publicized, sperm decline appeared to be more lasting and widespread. Experts attributed the increasingly chronic nature of these emergencies to several factors. These included high institutional semen quality standards, sexually transmitted diseases among potential donors, policy limitations on donation usage, and hesitations to donate biomaterial because of what was referred to as cultural hurdles. But unlike past emergencies, men's reproductive health experts in 2013 were also now more forthrightly drawing connections between the decline of sperm and the rise of industrial pollution. Sperm bank emergencies had gone from regional concerns about the effects of lifestyle changes among China's young men to a topic of national conversation about the pollution of China's environment. In the straightforward words of one sperm bank coordinator quoted in the Shanghai Morning Post, "If the environment is bad, sperm become ugly." Many people reacted to this report of ugly sperm in social and print media outlets. Some newspaper commenters made practical suggestions for individuals in light of the lack of immediate solutions to widespread environmental problems. They recommended avoiding smog by staying indoors and eating detoxifying food to preserve fertility. But many others interpreted sperm decline as more than an individualized problem, and instead as a broader issue with national and intergenerational dimensions. Hundreds of users of the popular social media platform Weibo responded to the news story. Many made serious jokes, wondering if pollution was perhaps the latest version of China's notorious birth planning policies. Others emphasized the intergenerational stakes of sperm decline in a bad environment, writing, "The cost of society's development is sacrificing the next generation. Sad." Echoing such intergenerational sentiment, the reporter for the Shanghai Morning Post, who originally wrote about the ugly sperm, stated, "In the view of fertility experts, taking care of the earth equals taking care of ourselves and of the next generation." Such reactions to the story of ugly sperm showcase an argument central to my book and at the heart of much feminist analysis of reproductive substances. When people anxiously discuss the decline of reproductive potential, they are talking about much more than the threat of individual fertility. They are also talking about a threat to the reproduction of social, national, and economic order. Such an argument is not just a social scientific talking point, it's an interpretation increasingly made by people around the world who are concerned about the intergenerational repercussions of toxic exposures. How toxicity in material and immaterial forms influences the ability of people and other beings to reproduce physically and culturally is increasingly articulated as an urgent question by and for many. Infertile Environments explores how and why reflections on the causal factors of infertility are being reimagined and redefined at a moment of growing attention to toxic exposures and pollution. Why is men's infertility in particular, and reproductive and developmental health more generally, such an important lens through which people understand the imbalance of their relationship to one another and to the environment? What does the environment mean to those researching and otherwise reflecting on its relationship to reproduction and development? I approach these questions through a focus on epigenetic toxicology. Today, toxicology is defined as the study of the potential harmful effects of chemicals, substances, or situations on humans and animals. Epigenetic research, frequently referred to simply as epigenetics, is typically thought of as the study of modifications to genes that affect gene expression without changing the sequence of DNA. Conditions such as poverty, lifestyle factors such as diet, or events such as famine or trauma are now referred to as exposures or environments that are thought to have epigenetic effects, as you see depicted here. The way we live our lives, the environments within and around us, and the things we are exposed to are thought to change the expression of DNA, even though they do not change DNA themselves. In addition, epigenetic research often investigates the potential intergenerational effects of these modifications through animal experiments and through birth cohort research. Epigenetics has been interpreted as a potential corrective to the gene-centric view of health, disease, and even fate. By moving to that which lies beyond the gene, epigenetics potentially diminishes the power of genetic determinism, showing how biology in general and in parsed biological units, such as sperm, is shaped by what stands beyond it. However, many remain skeptical of epigenetic research practices and the revolutionary label affixed to such pursuits. Social scientists have shown that so-called post-genomic approaches, which claim to go beyond the gene in their studies of genetic expression and inheritance, often rely upon and conscript a genetic approach. Still, epigenetic thinking and research offer a depiction of biology that partially overlaps with scholarly work that has historicized and complicated the category of life itself. Epigenetic research stresses that biology is not something that is given, but that is made and remade, be it through environmental exposures or technological interventions. Something I hope this book contributes to conversations about epigenetics is what, following Donna Haraway, Judith Farquhar, and others, I call situating epigenetic research practices. At times, social scientists describe epigenetic research and discourse as if it exists outside the situations in which it is practiced. This perpetuates the assumption that the values, ontologies, and imaginaries of the places in which social scientists most frequently study epigenetics are the universal default, and that social scientists' critiques of epigenetics in general apply to epigenetic research practices everywhere. Certainly, epigenetic research practices work in and through transnational assemblages of scientific infrastructure, research trends, languages, and vocabularies. But they, like other scientific practices, are also influenced by socioeconomic inequities, national and regional funding mechanisms and priorities, and ethical expectations and configurations. Situated expressions of sexism, racism, nationalism, and individualism also influence the assumptions and stereotypes embedded in scientific research. Throughout the chapters, I show that the group of toxicologists I studied materialize certain environments and not others, due not only to transnational scientific conversations, but also because of political and industrial histories, institutional infrastructures, and particular articulations of gendered and racialized stereotypes and reproductive expectations. These circumstances are not the context of epigenetic science. They are part of epigenetic research practices, and they inform the scales at which epigenetic environments are brought into being. In the first chapter of the book, The National Environment, I show how epigenetic research practices both are situated within contexts and are a part of reproducing those contexts or environments. The chapter begins in 2005, when an early version of the global sperm crisis is said to wash up on China's shores. The term global sperm crisis, sparked in 1992 by the research of a group based in Denmark, signaled a decline of sperm counts and quality over the past 50 years that was thought to be linked to environmental change the world over. Debate about such claims resulted in another hypothesis that sperm decline was not global, but instead was a matter of geographic variation. This is where the Detox Lab enters, a small group of researchers, including professors and graduate students based out of a major medical university in Nanjing, which I refer to as the Nanjing Institute of Medicine and Science. Detox Lab researchers began by studying the occupational environment's potential effects on the sperm of pesticide factory workers in Jiangsu province. Though to some extent participating in a kind of DNA fetishization, their research pointed out DNA's vulnerability to geographically specific environmental factors, pointing to the workplace as a site through which the embodied effects of China's unique role in the world economy as the largest producer and consumer of pesticides at the time could be understood. Moreover, this initial study's findings reverberated with growing national concern about population quality amid restrictive birth planning policies. Sperm with DNA damage theoretically had the capacity to fertilize, leading the team to suggest that the quality of future populations was potentially at stake in situations of occupational exposure. Subsequent research on men's infertility among the general population, defined as those not working in factories, showed that everyday exposure levels among infertile men living in Nanjing were many times higher than those reported in other national settings. This finding created a transnationally comparative lens through which a toxic national environment came into view. Finding a toxic national environment as partially responsible for sperm decline, the detox lab suggested that China's industrial pollution and lax environmental regulations were not just bad for individual men, but also for the nation and its population. The national environment is then a comparative context brought into being to contrast conditions of toxic exposure in China to other countries, drawing attention to the geographic variation of global sperm decline. The chapter goes on to discuss how the national environment is not only materialized in research practices, but also experienced by researchers who compare and contrast the advantages and disadvantages of their regional and national settings. The national environment is a means to compare experiences of conducting science in places that are understood to have different ethical scales, populations, and socioeconomic situations, which create both research opportunities and research constraints. Chapter 2, the hormonal environment, discusses endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, through an analysis of a 2010 Greenpeace China report titled Swimming in Poison. The report was referenced by toxicologists from the detox lab during my first in-person meeting with them, and was modeled on previously conducted toxicology experiments conducted in other labs. Greenpeace took on the challenge of making EDC studies and findings of harmful toxic effects a matter of public concern. Quite unsurprisingly for the toxicology community, the report found that fish from collection points along the Yangtze River showed elevated levels of harmful environmental hormones. But surprisingly for toxicologists who had been writing about the harms of environmental hormones, or EDCs, for years, the report went viral in print and social media and seemed to lead to the government's creation of a registry to help monitor and eventually regulate some EDCs. Many social scientists and humanities scholars have critiqued EDC science and activism for its heteronormative pathologizing of reproductive and developmental harm, drawing attention to what Giovanni DiCiro calls sex panic that emerges around EDC's potential gender-bending effects. Social scientists have highlighted how EDC research problematically interprets diversion from the sex binary as pathology. The gender bending, particularly emasculating qualities of a variety of endocrine disruptors, has been circulated as the hook that draws attention to the issue of EDC exposure. This chapter of my book shows that such sex panic is not necessary for EDC activist success, nor is it a universal option. On gender bending sex transgression as the potential harm of EDCs. Actions focus on the solution, industrial, the scope of the last note, a series of milk powder scandals, including serious cases that resulted in many infant deaths, were loosely connected to the swimming and the report I argue that the analytic potential of the hormonal environment and of toxicology more generally might be better mobilized through cultivating attention to underlying social, political, and economic causes rather than through drumming up panic over harmful sex-gender-related effects. So, quick question. I'm getting a little note that says my internet connection is unstable. Can you all hear me and see me okay?
It was breaking up for 1 minute, 30 seconds. So, but I guess we just have to carry on, right?
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm on campus, so I'm not sure why it's doing that, but
Yeah,
just
it was breaking up.
okay, just flag me if it happens again, and I'm happy to back up a bit.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
All right, so moving on. So epigenetic research often focuses on the way diet influences the health of future generations, drawing attention to the intergenerational impacts of what Hannah Landecker has called food as exposure. The effects of phytoestrogenic plants, or plants that naturally contain EDCs, are of particular concern to reproductive and developmental toxicologists. So in the third chapter, the dietary environment, I think through studies of soy consumption and its disputed influence on men's reproductive health, particularly the health of sperm. I show how a US-based study that found negative influences of soy consumption habits motivated the Detox Lab to launch its own investigation of soy sperm relations in and with what they defined as Chinese men. This comparative study of soy brought a Chinese body into being, said to be distinguishable from a Western body, or from a US body, from a European body, through dietary habits, metabolic capacities, and genetic polymorphisms. In the Detox Lab's research on the dietary environment, they attempted to counter research assumptions about the negative effects of phytoestrogens on men in general by studying Chinese men in particular, represented through samples collected from a few specific locations in the PRC. They also attempted to counter the tenacious stereotypes of femininity and masculinity historically aligned with East and West. But in doing so, they ended up reasserting a familiarly deterministic idea of race as genetically definable, resulting in what I call the racialization of the metabolism. Through its implicitly comparative dimensions, here China's dietary environment becomes as materially and semiotically fixed as the category Chinese men. In the fourth chapter, the maternal environment, I turn from the laboratory to a partnering hospital to consider the argument commonly made by social scientists that epigenetic research exaggerates maternal blame for inherited conditions. Drawing on fieldwork in a neonatal unit that treats congenital disorders and participates in the Detox Lab's research, I show that some epigenetic studies can encourage physicians and patients to de-individualize ideas of maternal responsibility. In particular, I discuss the Detox Lab's research on Hirschsprung's disease, research that during which biological samples and accompanying environmental characteristics have been gathered from multiple generations, so infants, parents, and grandparents who are frequently in the hospital altogether. When these biological samples are taken, researchers simultaneously collect information regarding occupation, residency, potential toxic exposures through work or through living in certain areas. Additionally, researchers gather general air and water pollution figures for patients' residences. So here the hope is that this broad collection of data will eventually allow the lab to correlate DNA methylation patterns now known to be involved in the development of Hirschsprung's disease with specific environmental exposures, even as various versions of the environment are considered in and through one another. Through interviews with physicians and lab members, I argue that the understanding of personhood underlying critical social science of the maternal environment often relies on a Eurocentric model of the individual and thereby misses the potential of epigenetic research to interpret the person from a relational perspective. In this research, toxicologists bring into being a maternal environment that both reasserts responsibility for fetal health and places responsibility on intergenerational human and non-human kin. In Chapter 5, the laboratory environment, I explored the laboratory space in which the environment is both reduced and proliferated. I show how detox lab members demarcated, isolated, and measured the influence of environmental factors in and on animal models, while simultaneously observing the multiple exposures and complex contexts in which all animals, including animal models, live, eat, breathe, interact, and reproduce. Analyzing the practices involved in the detox lab's epigenetic experiments, I show how lab members both reduce the environment to factors that they attempt to control and multiply environments by understanding many of the materials, chemicals, and conditions of animals' daily lives in and outside of the laboratory as factors that might have effects in and across generations. Environments, typically one at a time, take center stage in particular studies. This is the isolating part. But looking closer, one can see the isolation is just part of what is happening. Other environmental factors are recognized in tandem with the isolated factor through practice. Some of this, there was feedback, sorry. But looking closer, one can see the isolation is just part of what is happening. Other environmental factors are recognized in tandem with the isolated factor through practice. Some of this recognition ends up in the literary representation of experiments. So humidity levels are recorded, food and water access is described. Some occur only in laboratory practices. The sperm of a dissected mouse is kept close to a lab member's chest as he walks quickly across the campus road from the toxicology lab to the reproductive endocrinology building where the computer-assisted semen analysis machine is kept. Still, other factors remain seemingly imperceptible. The high levels of particulate matter in the air outside, blowing through the crack in the laboratory window that wouldn't quite latch, located just above the mice cages, the noise and reverberations from the ever-present construction occurring on campus and across downtown Nanjing that sometimes shakes the building and the earth, the fumes from other solvents and chemicals being used in other experiments happening in the same laboratory on the bench next door. Even when toxicologists ignored or explained away these other components of the laboratory environment in order to focus on something specific, such multiplicity remains, both perceived and imperceptible. Through ethnographic depictions of experiments conducted by detox lab members, I show how many aspects of such environmental multiplicity are increasingly made explicit in their own research. This is what I, following Corey Hayden, refer to as environmental proliferation. Situating the laboratory in its social, cultural, and environmental settings is then not the exclusive analytical purview of science and technology studies. It is also the increasingly necessary work of those who study how environmental factors potentially influence intergenerational animal experiments in the laboratory environment. In the Coda, I reflect on the detox lab's birth cohort research that occurred after I left China and discuss the rise of intergenerational research in environmental health more broadly. I suggest that with the addition of multi-generation human birth cohort studies to the detox lab scientific repertoire, new questions have become possible, as has a new scale of research. Open-ended questions, indirect associations, and multifactorial studies have all come within grasp. What seems to remain impossible, however, is a creative interpretation of kinship in such research, a conceiving of relations that goes beyond the heteronormative chart pictured here, and that is so familiar to those of us who have studied the history of anthropology. I then ask, at a time of heightened attention to the environment from a variety of actors, how might attention to toxins bring into view intergenerational relations beyond biogenetic heteronormative kin? Might a focus on intergenerational health through cohort research or generational toxicology have the potential to catalyze creative understandings of toxic relationalities and responsibilities. And I really leave that as an open question. The epilogue is a short personal reflection on my struggles against the individualized burden of reproductive responsibility through a discussion of my son's birth and hospitalization due to breastfeeding jaundice. It's also an exploration of my paradoxical feelings towards the plastics that fed him and saved his life. My family's experience in the neonatal intensive care unit led to the resignation of an oversimplified toxophobia to a more nuanced understanding of the paradox of plastics. But it also made me question the ability of sciences such as epigenetics to truly shake the gendered individualist rhetoric surrounding infant health. The complexity of the causal factors that brought him under the UV lights brought me some comfort, but complexity also brought guilt, making me feel responsible for an increasing number of social and environmental factors that were largely out of my control, what Emily Martin calls a sense of empowered powerlessness. The book ends with a hope and call for reallocation of the pressures that come with the paradox of both plastics and parenting along less gendered, more communal lines. So that is a really brief summary of the book, and I'd be happy to explore any of the chapters in more depth and answer any questions you have about what I just presented. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Janelle. I really enjoyed the talk. And so while I'm sure people will have questions, but let's give them a few minutes to just gather their thoughts. And maybe we can start the discussions now if you are okay with it.
Yeah.
I really like how you like the multiplicities of environments that you emphasize in your book. I mean, in my own work, I don't look specifically at like the kind of environments that you were looking at, the hormonal environment, the maternal environment, but I always find it fascinating how people, in talking about the environment, how it reflects other environment, like the social environment, the political environment, as a way of talking about those things. So I really like how you emphasize that, and also it's in your title. I guess my question is more about the ethnographic location, because I've also done some research in Nanjing in the past. And as you know, Nanjing is an area with a lot of chemical industry. And do you think that influence, what kind of subjects the lab decided to look at? Do you think that is a factor? Because there are chemical industries actually, or toxic pollution is actually like, I would say like almost like a key theme in that area, of China. So would like to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think that I would give a yes and no answer. So I think that the particular place in which they are situated did influence the sorts of research questions they asked and the kinds of environments that they brought into being through their research. Especially in the beginning, I would say, when their research was very much pushing back on this idea that there's a universal problem of global sperm decline that needs to be addressed in a universal way. So especially in the beginning, the lab was really trying to understand how the particular growth of chemical production in their area was influencing the infertility of men in Nanjing potentially. So not just Nanjing, but in neighboring cities as well within Jiangsu province, they were really looking at how the particularities of their place in the world, right? But as their specific place in the world was contributing to the kind of sperm decline that they faced, the kind of DNA damage that they potentially faced by participating in this global economy in a really specific way. So I think what drew me to their research in particular was that they were making an intervention which was very place-based, which is what, anthropologists usually do, right? Or we're doing for a long time. Like, we're going to do this ethnography so we can show how globalization isn't just transforming the world in one way. It's like very specific in the way that it articulates, depending on a number of factors. And their research was making a similar move. It was saying, this isn't just global sperm decline. This isn't like a decline that's being distributed evenly. There are people who are producing pesticides for the world in China, and these people are going to be suffering from DNA damage in their sperm in a very particular way. So I think their location did play a role in research, especially in the beginning. But because there are also scientists who participate in transnational knowledge building endeavors, there's also there's a tension in their research to try to make it particular, but to also reach those wider audiences and participate in transnational scientific networks. So a lot of their research isn't place-based, such as the animal studies that I talk about at the end, or at least they try not to highlight the place-based aspects of their research. So trying to create animal models that would become that could be replicated in any location in the world is another aspect of their research. So at times their research takes advantage of their, it's weird to say takes advantage because it's really like the pollution that they're taking advantage of, but it's true. It takes advantage of the multitude of toxic exposures and the depth of toxic exposures in the area where they did their research, but at other times it tries to sort of bracket that and to just work within laboratory spaces that they try to control very carefully so that their knowledge could be taken up anywhere and recreated anywhere and doesn't depend on this and the site-based studies that they did more of initially. So that's a yes and no answer to your question. Like, it definitely, some of their research came out of where they were in Nanjing, and just like, as you said, the general sense of like living in a place that is polluted, but also some of it tried to like ignore that and to just set it aside so that they could do the sort of science that could be replicated anywhere.
Thank you. So I would like to open the floor up now. If you have any questions, you can use the raise hand function or just type your questions in the box. If there's no question yet, then I think I will continue asking another question that I have, which is about gender. I think another thing that I find your work really fascinating is that you shift the focus about infertility. Usually it's focused on women to men. Well, I see one question, maybe I should withhold mine for now. And so Gonzalo.
Hi, can you hear me? Hi.
Yes.
Yeah, I really enjoyed, like Loretta, your presentation, and I got even more curious about reading your book. I found your usage of the term environment in sort of multiple layers very creative and interesting in a way. And I have a question about ethics, or rather about the ethical considerations that are shaping epigenetics research in China. I mean, one of the driving arguments of your book and also of your presentation is the idea, of course, very familiar within the anthropology of science, that research within epigenetics as well as other fields in biomedicine, far from being universal, it is shaped obviously by all kinds of social, political, and moral factors that can be found in the process of the research, ongoing research within labs and so on. This is not to say, of course, that research, as you rightly pointed out in your presentation, does not have transnational dimensions, that models cannot circulate widely from one place to the other. But of course, as they ground themselves. This process of grounding involves translations, right? And you pointed out some of the translations, but I got a little bit more curious. I couldn't really see much of Chinese cultural and ethical issues in the presentation that you've done today. And I'm thinking about, for example, the issue of sperm decline and global sperm crisis in the Chinese context surely must be framed along Chinese cultural ideas about about the importance of patrilineal descent, about the importance of ancestors, and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm thinking about Chinese bioethics itself, and I'm thinking about a name, Qiu Renzong, I think, a bioethicist, very prominent in China. He himself has argued on a number of occasions that ancestor worship and patrilineal descent are more important than individual identity.
Mhm.
That's like a big statement, right? And this
Yeah.
coming from a bioethicist that, I mean, probably is also influential in epigenetics, certainly is influential in stem cell research, and also in assisted reproductive technologies. So I'm wondering, I suppose my question is, did you encounter these kinds of sort of ethical considerations, being formulated by your interlocutors in the lab and guiding the research that they were developing, or perhaps the conversations that you had with patients, or your participation in the triangulations between lab researchers, doctors, and patients? Could you tell us a bit more about that, please?
Yeah, and I think the chapter that addresses this the most is the chapter called The Maternal Environment, which is also published as an article version, which is called What If the Environment is a Person? And so in that article and in this chapter of the book, I do talk more about sort of the way that traditional kinship ideas and ideals in China in a way correspond to those kinds of epigenetic research that they're doing. So how this sort of importance of of patrilineal descent, or of intergenerationality, of connecting with one's ancestors and recognizing those connections as not just important like biologically, but culturally as well, is something that you can see in the way that epigenetic research sort of traces these connections, right? And that even like the way that hospital interactions were organized. So when infants were in the hospital, like in the neonatal care unit, because they had congenital disorders, multiple generations would be in the hospital with these infants and would stay the night with them. And this sort of family configuration actually made epigenetic research more possible, because they were able to so readily give samples to researchers from multiple generations. So the sort of the way that these ideals and kinship practices sort of became very apparent to me in the clinic was really important to my research. But I will say, like, my argument is not that that epigenetics is a version of Chinese thinking, like a more recent version of Chinese thinking, which I think is an argument that has been made elsewhere. What I'm trying to say in that chapter and article is that the people that I was doing research with, the physicians and the lead researcher of the detox lab, I think what they were doing through their epigenetic research was sort of pushing back on what they noticed as a kind of individualism that was taking over in the biomedical sphere. So they were sort of trying to counter the idea that people should feel responsible individually, especially these gendered notions of responsibility, by sort of de-individualizing their research practices, by saying to you, it's not actually your fault. It's all of these factors are contributing to your child being sick. So you shouldn't be so thankful to me. I'm just like showing you the scope of the problem. It's not just you. It's more than you. So they were sort of reasserting this this way of thinking about relations that is often classified as like the traditional Chinese way of conceptualizing kinship. And so what I'm trying to say in the book is that it's not just as easy as like looking to China for a model through which kinship exists, but recognizing that China is also a place that is changing and that kinship relations are changing there, and that physicians and scientists are also people who have stakes in that change and who want to think about the world think about relationships in their changing world in particular ways, and they're doing that through scientific practice. So those scientists and those physicians are also people who, struggled with their own kinship relations and being separated from their families due to having to move, or who worked through issues of pollution and like, do I want my kid to live in downtown Nanjing, or should we move to the suburbs so I can, have my child breathe fresh air? Like it was through those interactions with people, conversations with people, that I recognized how they were struggling with the problem themselves of like individualistic thinking, and were trying to push back on that, not only through their own practices, but through their science as well. So that's kind of a roundabout answer to your question, but I do think, it is something that comes up in the book, especially in that maternal environment chapter. I don't deny the importance of patrilineal descent or that model, but I'm not trying to highlight it, because I'm trying to show how, because other people have done that really well. First of all, other anthropological work has done that really well. And second, because I'm trying to show the complexity that these scientists and physicians are wrestling with, where their work is like always in tension between conceptualizing the maternal environment in this really individual way and pushing that idea of the maternal environment to other sorts of scales.
Any other questions?
Well, can I?
You want to
also-
pose?
I'm happy to ask another question, but I think you had another question, Loretta. Would you like to have a go first?
I think my question follow up on your questions, which is about that kind of classic anthropological debate about the particular and the general, right? So I think from your presentation and also from your answers, I get the feeling that you are trying to avoid saying that this is, kind of making an exception, that this is the Chinese case, this is how they do their scientific research, this is what the lab work is like. However, in your book title, you do have Chinese man in your book title. I had a quick browse through, one of the chapter I've read as a journal article. I think I've probably told you before. So I guess I still try to grapple with that particular and the general. So would you say that if the Chinese man, those two words are removed from the book title, I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, is how much of the book is about China as a particular case and what we can learn from that, and how much is about the general epigenetic practice in today's like scientific or the current lab work?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question that I wrestled with while I was writing the book, obviously, and while approving the subtitle as well. I'll leave it at that. The chapter where I talk about, there's two places in the book where I really try to not only wrestle with this problem myself, but show how the scientists I studied wrestled with it. It's the national environment, where the idea of China actually gets produced. So how does the national environment, how does China become an object of scientific study? Like, what data are researchers actually using when they claim something as a Chinese X, like a Chinese man or a Chinese location, right? What is the power of making that statement or that scale of claim? And how can we sort of dissect these categories when we look at the particular scientific practices? So in the chapter of the dietary environment, I really spell out like how do researchers in the US think about the category of the Asian, and how does that compare to the category of Chinese men that comes in the Detox Labs research? What sources of data are these two bodies drawing upon, and how do they become comparable entities when really they're talking about populations from different parts of the world that have different relationships to these categories? And so I think one of the things I wanted to do, which definitely is not clear by the subtitle, is that I wanted to, pull apart these categories a little bit and to show that they're made. And when they're made, they're not just made and then left, they're reproduced, right? And so reproduction here is more than just like a biological phenomenon. It's also a conceptual practice where environments are reproduced through sciences. And then that actually figures into the way that we think about physical reproduction. So I'm really trying to talk about conceptual and physical reproduction simultaneously to show how these categories are trafficked. But I don't have like an easy answer for this. Like, is it about China or is it about something else? Like, I don't know what the answer to that would be, but I get asked that question a lot, and I know why. It's because I struggled with that problem myself. Like, I did do research in a particular place with particular people. They were located within what is typically thought of as China. So I'm not trying to say that that doesn't exist, but I'm also trying to complicate the idea that this could that this particular study could then reflect a broader sort of epigenetic practice in China more generally. And I'm trying to wrestle with what it means to create knowledge that is general and particular at the same time.
Thank you. It really reminds me of the debates that Tim Choi talked about in his book, Ecology Comparison. So I understand where you're coming from, but because it's in the book title, so I was curious, which part is about the Chinese man, or is there any?
Well, if you could put quotes around Chinese men, I would feel more comfortable.
Okay. Right. So, sorry. Yeah. If you have a follow-up question.
Yeah. In a way, I think it follows up from your question, Loretta. I'm just wondering whether look, perhaps it might be a too ambitious question to ask. I mean, it's difficult enough to get inside the lab and do research and follow researchers' activities, as well as try to find a balance between social and cultural materials with knowledge of technical and scientific matters. But I wonder if, in the course of your research, you found moving away from your specific fieldwork context and thinking about Chinese epigenetic toxicology, this field as it developed in China in the last decades, would you say, is there something that comes across as obviously specific to the Chinese context? A set of questions, perhaps, a set of solutions being proposed? Would something strike an outside observer immediately as different? I wouldn't say unique, but perhaps something that would be outstanding. I'd like to hear you a bit more on this. Also, because I think there might be some epigenetic toxicologists here in this seminar room, I'm realizing. Not based in China. Yeah.
So one of the things I discuss in the book is the ability of researchers in China to take advantage of their location in particular ways. So I think that, that might not be the sort of trend that you're looking for, but for me, that was the most unique aspect of their research, was that they were able to do the kinds of studies that they wanted to do, especially birth cohort studies, with greater speed, with larger numbers of people, and with a greater number of toxic variables than others were able to because of their unique location, right? So this has to do with just numbers of people and sizes of cities, but it also has to do with ethical norms like IRB procedures and the speed at which research can be conducted. And the ways that people sign up for research more willingly, or not in certain circumstances. So I think a lot of those like really particular variables in terms of how research on humans can be conducted in China really could shape sort of the way that epigenetic toxicology plays out there, especially because, as I highlight at the end of the book, like birth cohort studies are becoming more and more popular in epigenetic toxicology or generational toxicology. And so if we want to take like a big data approach, which a lot of people do now, the number of birth cohorts that can happen in China and that can be made quickly, even though, they take multiple generations often, I think there's a lot of potential there for toxicology. And that's both a good and a bad thing, right? It's sad that the number of toxins and the level of toxic exposure is actually a benefit to scientific research, but in this case, it might be. So I think that would be one aspect that I would highlight as sort of a unique part of toxicology there. Again, I don't want to say that like toxicologists working in China are more prone to thinking about problems in particular ways, because that's not the argument of the book. But I think sticking with those like very specific circumstantial sort of positionality related numbers and timeframes could give a lot of insight about what is possible in China versus what is possible in other global locations where similar science is conducted. And that's one reason why so many people want partnerships with scientists in China, right? There is a benefit to that on both sides often. And so this place does not stand outside like a global economy of scientific production, and that plays a role in this as well.
Any questions from the audience? I was listening to your conversations, and I think one thing that struck me was how so this research, you say it was done like about 10 years ago or longer.
Yeah.
Given the current environment, the Cold War and all that, do you think it's possible at all for an anthropologist to do kind of ethnographic work in the lab in China anymore? Can you maybe comment on that? I'm really curious.
I don't think so, but I am in my I don't know. I think it would be difficult. I'll put it that way. More difficult than it was when I did it. And so, yeah, it's definitely not the same research landscape as it was then. And I think it's a trying time for students who, are trying to do their fieldwork in China for a variety of reasons. And this, I don't know if this would have been possible then. But because this research is so old, it also means that a lot of like the toxicology that's in it is quite dated at this point, right? There's been a lot of different sort of ways, epigenetics has really exploded and turned into this whole post-genomics, omics thing. And China is at the forefront of a lot of the omics research that's going on in a variety of areas, not just epigenetics, but all sorts of omics research. So there is so much to be studied in China, and I hope that the anthropology of science can continue there. Because there's such important research happening, but it's just that this research project was, so long ago that it hasn't quite caught up with all of the new research that's happening there on so many different issues.
Okay, so any other questions? Gonzalo,
yeah,
sure.
I have a very quick question, just out of curiosity. A few years ago, Stephen Harrell and myself, we published a volume entitled Transforming Patriarchy, and there was a chapter by Kirsten Klein about sperm donation, and it's one of the things we learned from Kirsten's work is that there's a lot of taboo surrounding sperm donation in China, and I know it's not the main topic of your research, but obviously it's clearly related. Because in the context in which we are having a talk of a sperm crisis at all levels, right? So the question is, what are the alternatives? And obviously the alternatives, or one of the alternatives, is to set up a national infrastructure of sperm banks, right?
Yeah.
I don't know, really, I haven't been following that conversation, and Kirsten's research at the time was mostly focusing on the 2010s. 10 years have passed. We had COVID. I have no idea how sperm banks have developed in China in the last few years, but I wonder if you could tell us something about that, and also just out of curiosity, whether there are some estimates, statistics about male infertility rates at present in China, just out of curiosity. That's a personal curiosity. Thank you.
Yeah. So, okay, a couple things. I don't want to lose track of these different threads, but okay, when I was doing this research, something that was super fascinating to me about it was that even though, these conditions of toxic exposure that this toxicologist were studying were greater in a lot of areas of China, especially in Jiangsu province, male infertility rates were expected or reported to be the same as other parts of the world. So I asked multiple times to the people I was studying, if this is the reason that people are infertile, then why are infertility rates not higher in China than they are in other places in the world? And the reason, they said, is because infertility rates are not the same thing as sperm damage, right? So like I talked about really briefly in the talk, sperm can be damaged but still fertilize. And so what they were really interested in is understanding the nuances of sperm decline, right? Not the global high number, so numbers fall, that's one thing, but there's so much more than just numbers when it comes to analyzing sperm. And so they really wanted to emphasize these more these pathways to fertilization that might leave some of that damage intact, and then would have intergenerational consequences that were, more difficult to trace than infertility. And so by sort of turning away from sperm decline as it's usually conceptualized, they really emphasize the intergenerational risk of toxic exposure to sperm. And there were actually, some of them were writing against the procedure of ICSI, intercytoplasmic sperm injection, which is often used with IVF, because they thought that that sort of bypassed this sort of natural selection of sperm in the process of fertilization. So that was another aspect of the research. Anyhow, I want to go back to the sperm donation, sperm banks question. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with I.O. Wahlberg's work, but he writes more about this and would probably be the best person to answer the question that I know of. But I will say something that he talks about in his book is the rise of something called fertility insurance in China. And this is a way for individuals who are concerned about the effects of pollution on their sperm to freeze sperm and to keep it safe in a cryopreservation tank for when they want to use it. So there is the rise of not just sperm banks for infertility, but also sperm banks for just maintaining one's sperm at a like less polluted level, basically. So I think that's a really interesting phenomenon. I mean, most of the sperm collected for the studies that I write about is done during the process of infertility assessments. So it's not like they are asking donors to then contribute sperm, which they'll analyze. It's more research that's done in the course of an investigation into why someone is infertile. So there weren't the same complications regarding whether or not people wanted to donate sperm. But I assume in their birth cohort studies, they are coming up against more of those issues. And Vincent Adams has also written about that in a collaborative article about blood donation as well as sperm donation and some of the obstacles that people who are collecting donations in both those categories faced. But yeah, the rise of sperm banks, the nationalization of sperm banks. So there are a number of national sperm banks. As far as I know, all sperm banks are regulated by the government in China. So there is a system of sperm bank regulation there. And then the rise of these independent insurers, private insurers, is like sort of outside that banking system. So it's a different sort of private banking for individuals who are concerned about fertility. But yeah, Io Wahlberg's work on cryopreservation and the rise of sperm banks alongside the rise of reproductive technologies in China would be an interesting place to look.
Thank you. I don't know if I can still ask another question. It's a very quick question, but you know, if perhaps someone else from the audience would like to ask a question. If you want to know anything about epigenetic toxicology, maybe that's the moment to ask.
I see some familiar names in the audience too.
Yeah, Donna Drucker just said, I need to log off now, but
I saw that, yeah.
For the discussion, yeah. Loretta, would you mind if I just ask a very quick question? I think it's probably, I was expecting someone to ask this question. I think you hinted at it, but I suppose it's probably a question that everybody asks you, Janelle, which is obviously you mentioned women at the beginning of your talk, and you described your choice of reproductive your focus on the reproductive health of men as deliberate, given that it's a new area of growth within in China and also globally. But I wonder if you had the opportunity to reflect on contrasts between, you know, the research that is being done on men and women, and whether something particularly interesting comes out of that comparison in the Chinese context. I know it's a very big question, but I just wonder if there's something interesting that could come out of that comparison. If you'd like to share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see in the way that the maternal environment is discussed in epigenetic research that women play sort of this dual role of being the sort of neutral vessel for a lot of this transformation, and the the people that are influenced by this transformation. So for men, that I think the focus on how epigenetic change harms men comes across more clearly, whereas women, have this sort of, sure, they might suffer harm, but they're also the vehicles through which that harm occurs. And I think that at first, when I was looking at this research, I really thought that the dispersal of the maternal environment into all these different kinds of kin, like pollution, chemicals as kin, and grandparents as kin, and all these different sorts of kin would really do a lot to sort of take the focus of responsibility off of women and distribute it more broadly. But I'm not sure that's the case. And I think that, that in my reading of other research that's done on Chinese women who are pregnant or doing prenatal testing, things like this, it seems like maternal burdens have not diminished, and that if anything, men will now be burdened also, but not more so than women. And so it's hard to see like the rise of men's reproductive health as like countering the burden on women. It's more like it's just making both genders be burdensome in these different ways. And I guess that's my pessimistic reading of the situation. It's not, things haven't like tipped the scale. It's just the sort of burden of individuals to be accountable to all these potential sources of exposure, and to be aware of exposure, and to protect one's body and one's bodily substances from exposure is being distributed across genders instead of moving from one gender to the other. That's my reading of the situation.
Thanks for sharing. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I guess I will close the seminar, but before I do that, because just now you've just mentioned, kind of tapped on the topic of gender, I just want to say a few things. So I taught your article, I think it's called Swimming in Toxins or something.
Swimming in Poison.
Yeah, in my class last term. And one of the feedback that I find really interesting from students was that they find it, so just now we were talking about what's particular and what's general between China and the larger world, and they say they find it really interesting that these ENGO in China emphasize that kind of duality of the male and the female so much. I mean, for this generation of students, they think it's unimaginable for them that the environmental NGOs nowadays, if they talk about toxics and how it impacts male and female, to them, I mean, it's not something that occurred to me when I read it, because I'm not in that generation, but my students told me that they find it really striking that the gender difference, especially when it's just about male or female and there's no other third gender, was like picked up by the NGOs in China so unquestionably. So that's just a feedback from my student after they read your article.
That's really interesting. And I found a similar, I taught anthropology at reproduction this semester, and I found a similar response. Just like the binary is not the same binary, that, is not the same, it's not received in the same way. And I think that probably the environmental NGOs are moving away from that framework, I would think. But, that was the criticism of it, that it was embracing the binary.
I'm not sure about that in China, if they are moving away from it in China, but I find it really interesting that when I read it, it doesn't occur to me as problematic.
As problematic.
Someone who do research in China is very, I mean, it's almost like expected how the NGO would frame it. Like
but it also wasn't the thing that got picked up in China. Like that wasn't what the media went with, right? They went with different aspects, and that's what made that's what drew so much attention to the report. At least that's what I argue in the article. It wasn't like these fixed binary harms that were the focus of the media attention to that report. At least that's what I argue, having analyzed it all. But yeah, I see what you're saying with the generational differences in the understanding of sex, gender, And I think that's a much more hopeful note than the one I just mentioned about the gender burdens. So,
but wouldn't you say that epigenetic toxicology, not just in China but globally, continues to reproduce that binary completely, right?
oh, for sure. Yes, it's very heteronormative. Kinship can only be considered in these very particular ways. And so that's what I write about at the end of the book. Like, isn't there space here to sort of articulate a different kind of kinship that goes beyond not just the human, but also rethinks human kinship in new ways? Like, is there space for queering toxicology a bit? And if so, what would that look like? So that's sort of the open question that I end the book with.
I think that's wonderful. So thank you so much, Janelle. I really enjoyed the talk and more importantly, the discussion, and also get to know you.
Yes.
So the webinar will be uploaded on the website, and you're free to share with your colleagues and your friends. And thank you so much for your time today. And
thank you so much for the invitation and for all your questions. I really appreciate it. It was great to be here, and I had fun talking with you all.
Thank you, and congratulations on the publication of the book this year.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.